small community. We can probably all know each other from various conferences, and a lot of the people that are working at the New York Times or Washington Post or NPR are also very friendly and open. So there's a Python community that I'm a part of. Python's one of the more dominant languages used. Ruby is also very popular. But Python is really liked by developers because it's a very readable code. There's a lot of documentation, which is very helpful when you're building something on deadline. And Adrian was also one of the first sort of journalist developers, and he, as co-creator of Django, was a Python developer, and so it may just also be coincidence that a lot of us like Python. Alan, who's a traditional software programmer, was hired by the Min Post, and I thought his definition or his perspective on what it's like to develop in a newsroom was sort of interesting. And the way that he defined it meant that it's really about making the news with code. So you're not so much working sort of in the basement where no one knows your name or no one's kind of understanding or seeing your work. You're sitting there with reporters and editors on deadline, screaming across the room at each other, swearing at each other, and you're producing something that is actually being seen and used by people, possibly hours from the time that you built it. The reason that we're kind of turning more and more toward doing development work and bringing more developers and designers into our newsrooms is because the world is getting a lot more complex. It used to be, for example, we would put the police blotter together by walking into the police station and with our notebooks and our pens, and we would take the handwritten logs that they put together for the past couple of days, copy it down, go back, type it back up, and you get the week's blotter that you would see in the paper. And now we've got programs that are collecting and mapping crime data for law enforcement within 24 or 48 hours, and they're able to kind of see patterns, and we need to be able to read that too, and to understand not just what those patterns are, but how did they get to that place where they are identifying these patterns. We are also building tools that help us do our jobs better. So Django, as I mentioned earlier, is one of those tools. Document Cloud is another, helping us with large troves of data to quickly translate that in OCR. FOIA Machine is another tool that's been recently built, which is one of my favorites. It helps you automate your FOIA requests. So if there's a public record data set or an email or something that you would like to get from a public official, they will tell you no. You go and you file a FOIA request, and then they legally have to turn it over to you. So this tool kind of helps you keep track of them, and there are timing deadlines and various other things. So it ends up being a very, very useful piece of software. We're also telling stories differently. So we're no longer just printing, a 1,000-word story in the newspaper with a big dominant photo and maybe some sidebars. ProPublica did a really nice job with this piece, which was talking about payments that pharmacy companies and such make to doctors. They took millions of records that were previously inaccessible, and you wouldn't be able to kind of see the big picture, put them all together into a searchable database that people can now kind of look up their own doctor and see what's going on. Another format for storytelling, the New York Times has been experimenting with news games. So they put together this Gauging Your Distraction, which is about texting while driving. And so the game is actually built off of research and reporting work that they did, and then they build it so that it's telling you when to switch 6 lanes and you're trying to text at the same time. So it's a really interactive way to bring somebody into the dangers of texting and driving, to kind of back up all of the reporting that had been done. The LA Times has used some programming work to pull things from its archives, particularly recipes. So they built this cookbook. They processed about 6,000 recipes that were just big blobs of text, and they used natural language processing, the Python toolkit, to figure out how these stories were structured and to pull them out. So at different holiday times, you'll see that this rotates. They're able to kind of group recipes and present really interesting and engaging material for their readers as well. We're also talking an awful lot now about algorithmic accountability. So it's again that idea of the black box. The government, not business and government, are getting very complex about how they're making decisions that impact their lives. One example might be a social service agency who's trying to cut down on fraud and kind of best allocate resources on very small budgets. They're turning to algorithms to help them evaluate foster parents, for example. In this case, an algorithm might look at an association and see that someone who would apply to be a foster parent has a brother or a sister who's a convicted felon. Whereas before, that may have still come up during a background check. It would have been done on a case-by-case basis, evaluated by a person, and you would have been judged, based on those kind of factors. Now we're building software that means that person may never get in front of anyone to make a subjunctive decision, so it will automatically rule them out. So our question is, is that the right decision to make? Is that, how did that algorithm reach that decision? We want to be able to explain that and raise these questions when they are becoming very much a part of our lives. So Brian Boyer, who's at NPR, he also comes from a programming developer background, not a traditional journalist. He's been doing some really interesting things with the teams that he's leading, and I thought this was a really insightful way that he described what it's like to work in a newsroom. It is a little bit of a wild, wild west right now, which is also fun. The jobs are not well defined. You'll find yourself working on a wide range of projects and using a bunch of different languages and learning as you go. And if you are at all interested, there are a couple of resources. ProPublica has a Newsnerd blog that they post a lot of the behind the scenes of how they built certain apps. And they've also created some style guides that some of the other folks in the journalism community are adopting. So they have a code manifesto that kind of lays out some ideas that are being embraced as to how developers are coding and working in newsrooms. And if you are even more interested and you think you might want to work in the journalism world, Source is a very good spot for job listings. You can kind of look through and see what the expectations are for that. And just to give you a little bit of background, so I am working on a project right now with Katrina, who's sitting here with me. And it's a new startup, a media startup, and we are working with public records. We're building a tool that will be useful for reporters internally, but public-facing will allow people to do research on public records, but within context. You're not just going to get raw spreadsheets. So one of the first data sets that we are getting ready to release are campaign finance reports for the city of Pittsburgh. That is a picture of the campaign finance reports as they are filed right now. Most of them are handwritten. A few are typed. Some of them you can tell were even built in spreadsheets, but they were not filed that way. So you have to re-enter all of this data into spreadsheets. Here's an example. This is just a list of all of the reports that have been translated from those hard copies and into our database now. So we're kind of keeping track of which files from which candidates and which years we've already inputted the data. This is an example of what those pieces of data about the contributions look like. Again, you can see handwritten versus typed, but still in tables that are in no way, shape, or form machine readable. I tried. And so this is just a look at the way that we've been structuring the data. We're in the middle of designing the database that will pull from this. So you can see, for example, some of the things we'll be able to tell is Lewis here got very, very interested in politics between 2011 and 2013, significantly increasing his contribution. That's just sort of a quick snapshot of some of the things that we'll be able to see once we start aggregating all of this work. Also kind of looking at what are the questions that we're going to answer. Not only are we putting in the contribution data, but we're mashing it with other databases so that we'll, again, be able to bring context to the information. So we're going to look at, how are the big donors distributing their money across political officials. We're going to look at the timing of the donations, so we can take a database of the contracts that the city has issued and the timing that those were introduced and debated and then approved, and you can overlay that with the campaign donations to see if any patterns are emerging. We're also looking at, what might it cost to win an election. In addition to the donations, the officials also have to file how they spent the money that came in, so you can get a sense of what it's like to run a campaign and where that is going. All that said, there is a lot of caution when you're working with government data. This was a story that The Atlantic published just this week. That is a really, really nice read if you're at all interested in this. Google it. She thought that she was a data professor and journalist, and she saw that her the questions that her kids were bringing home on their homework assignments were really aligned for the standardized testing. And she said, well, what if you don't have the book that the test is based off of? How are kids going to pass these tests? So she went to the schools and started asking about their book inventory, thinking that the database, she could kind of work with that and help give them some answers about how to better distribute books. And the database existed and it looked current, but there were a lot of flaws to it because of the way that the staff and people were using it. So, this was a quote from her in that story. We tend to think of data as this immutable truth. We forget that data and data collection systems are created by people. This is true as well for the campaign contribution work that we're doing. Not only, are we finding that there are math errors, so the candidates may have added up certain columns and put their balance as we collected X amount, but as you're inputting the data, you're finding that they made simple, addition errors throughout, or perhaps they forgot to file a whole page of contributions, and that's why the number's off. So we're kind of ending up going back and fact-checking the folks who filed the work. But you'll also find weird rules, so like the county requires that like contribution reports be filed within like a 2 or 3 week period between the one report filing period and the other. It's around the primary and there are reasons for it, but it complicates things because the candidates will sometimes include those in their post-primary reports or not. So you have to know, not only what are the county rules, what are they legally required to do, but then what is their common practice. And sometimes you can only get at that by really working with the data and then making a phone call and saying to the person who filed the reports, hey, what was your interpretation of that law and how did you end up following it? So we do a lot of cleanup like that. Also a lot of things just because we are hand entering it. You have to do things that kind of protect yourself from entering errors into the system. So we've worked on some bulletproofing techniques for that. And then as we're matching it with other databases, we're kind of considering other things. One of the questions that we have is, are the donations coming from the people that are actually city residents? Or are donations for city officials coming from people who have interests outside the city? What about at the district level? Is the city councilman getting most of his donations from the district that he represents, or are those coming from other areas of the city, and might that influence how he might allocate resources? But one of the ways that we can do that, the address field is entered for every donor, but it turns out that even though they're supposed to be entering their mailing address, which the county interprets as their home address, they might be putting their work addresses in, or PO boxes. So we have to kind of think through, if we're going to map this and we want to answer that question, can we do it with the data that we have? Is that address data good enough to actually tell us this information? And if it's not, what are the ways that we can still get to that answer? So we're looking at maybe matching up the voter registration database, comparing those addresses and pulling out the people that match so that we know for sure that they're residents. Matching up the employer addresses that we have in the database and pulling them out and saying, oh, these are work addresses. We may get to a point, we would like to classify the donors by industry, particularly PACs and companies that are donating. When we started looking at how do we classify that, there is a classifier that is commonly used by the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor, a bunch of federal agencies and trade associations, but they all use it differently. It's completely subjective and it's based on their own programmatic needs. So is there a good way for us to adopt? Should we adopt one? OSHA's over, say, the trade association or someone else's. The city of Pittsburgh kind of collects this information too. Some of the other sites, Sunlight Foundation, Open Secrets, they're using that same system, but they're coding it themselves. So they're using their own subjectivity to classify that. So we kind of looked at that, and at this point, we decided that that's going to be something we'll do later down the road, because we can't say for sure at this moment, what the best strategy for that might be. But I also, before I hand it over to Andrew, I wanted to introduce Katrina, and she does not have a journalism background, so she's been working with me on this project as a programmer, and I thought it would be nice to share some of the experiences on that.
Yeah, so like AmyJo said, I don't have a background in journalism. I don't really have a background in programming yet. I have a bachelor's in history. I recently finished Hackbright Academy, which is like a 12-week intensive boot camp in San Francisco for women who are interested in getting into programming. With Hackbright, I did a small project on my own towards the end where I actually I did some campaign finance work. So I took some data you can get online for free through GovTrack and through Open Secrets, and I tried to sort of mash it together. And I built a very basic thing that would let you look at a bill and then see how members of Congress were funded from like relevant industries about that bill. So I came to a meetup about a month ago, and I met AmyJo, who was doing something that was very similar to what I was interested in. So this has been a really exciting process for me because I have all these interesting programming things I've learned, like how do you design a database, and how do you build a database, and how do you build a working web app to do these visualizations. But it also marries like the interest that I had just on my own about politics. And I'm really interested in this process we're doing of trying to bring like greater transparency and greater accessibility to information about campaign finance in Pittsburgh. So yeah, so it's been really interesting from the programming side because I have these ideas just like as a person who's interested and want to know things, but then AmyJo has this perspective that's like, well, no, they're not going to do it this way because they don't have to, and they're not going to do it unless they make them. And you might think that you should have this information, but no, that information is not going to be anywhere, and this is totally useless. So it's been just sort of really illuminating. I took campaign finance data at the federal level and worked on it on my own, and I was like, oh my gosh, like why did they design it this way? Like this is so nonsensical. And then the more we talk, I'm like, oh, they designed it that way because it makes sense to do it that way, because that's how information works. So yeah, so it's been exciting so far, and I'm excited to see where we can go with it. So,
so if anyone has questions for either one of us, we're happy to answer. Yeah.
Yeah. It's been my experience with systems like this that data is usually garbage and somebody's consuming it, right? And so if somebody's consuming it, then there's usually pushback to keep it clean and everything. So now that you guys are going through this effort and in a way are preparing it to be consumed, have you noticed any feedback or any pushback to the people who are entering the data to get it cleaner? Is there any pressure being applied to the sources?
Well, I'm entering the data, so.
But I mean from the source documents, the people who are preparing the documents.
Not yet, because they aren't aware of this project yet. So these records have been filed. They have to file usually an annual report. And then if there's an election that year, they'll file 2 primary reports and then 2 general election reports to disclose their donors. So because this is not an election year, it's actually good for us because the data is kind of slowed down a little bit. But I think that once this goes up, it'll be interesting to see. No one has looked at donors in aggregate across the city. It's always been a spot check based on that election, based on the reports filed for those just a couple months at a time.
But I guess keying on some of the things you're saying, like we don't know if this is their work address or their home address, this page is missing, things like this. When they submit it, the person who's receiving it, I would imagine at some point, maybe a journalist would say, hey, this is a hot mess, run a story, and then apply pressure to the agency that's receiving it to maybe vet the information a little better.
Yes.
Do you see that coming? Or?
It's possible. It's happened before when journalists have published stories and said that data is a hot mess and the laws aren't being followed on certain things. So it's possible.
we're hoping.
So yes, I actually have some experience from the other side. I was Patrick Dowd's campaign treasurer for his council races. So I have filed some of these reports, and I can give you the electronic copies for Patrick Dowd's. So that's my first thing. These forms are awful. They don't make any sense. The rules are not clear. The business addresses, I think LLCs can count as individuals or something.
They can't. So
Which I didn't learn until like halfway through my time filling out these reports. I'm like, oh, that's why. And the annual reports, like I learned that the office is okay if you just file like from the last report you filed till the end of the year. Whereas I was like repeating the whole year.
You're one of those.
Yes.
That took me some time to figure out because it was like, oh, they have all the duplicates.
But like the rules don't make any sense. If someone says annual report, that sounds like it should cover the whole year. And it turns out, no, it actually doesn't. So none of this makes any sense. It's horrible. I have wanted something better than these forms to, because I have all this data in spreadsheets. I don't want to fill out these forms.
Well, it's interesting. So there are two things. They actually have the option to file. It's so cute on the form. They say check if you have a discount.
Yeah.
Okay,
So I don't trust them in the office because they had someone was on vacation and they misfiled a report that we filed, and like I had the paper with the stamp on it. I'm like, no, we filed it. You have it in your office, and they like lost it. So I don't trust them in the elections office.
well, and the
So
reality
I'm not
is,
giving them anything electronic because they'll be like, we don't know how to use this.
Yeah.
Our kid won't read this. So I just give them the paper.
and the reality is, there are also candidates who are a bit savvy about this, and they know if they file it by paper, it's going to be a lot harder for reporters and people who are interested to go through and kind of understand that data too. So it's a strategy. But we have had the question, well, why don't we go to the candidates that did obviously use some spreadsheet software? And the answer to that is, yeah, we could do that, but that's not what was officially filed with the county. And so, not that,
Yes, you still have to
don't
take time to
trust
compare,
politicians, but you don't know what, you want what was officially filed, because then there is theoretically legal repercussions if they've tampered with it or something's inaccurate.
So I'd love, I have almost built this, but I have a problem starting projects and have not let myself start this one. Like a web app where campaigns can enter this stuff and then print out the form that needs to go to the office, but have this already be online. I would love that. That would be fantastic, and I think a lot of the campaigns would love that. So I know there probably are campaigns that are filing these things to hide things, but Habitat very much did not want to hide anything, wanted to be very open about everything, and I would have loved to not have to deal with these stupid forms. So,
Well, then we
maybe
should
that's
talk
your
about
next guess. I have notes for you. I
Okay.
have more stories.
So I read the article about the Philadelphia Student Center textbooks, and one of the main reasons why the data was so flawed was because they didn't have funding, or they didn't have the people to put in their correct information about the textbooks. They didn't have the funding to pay for textbooks. There was $0 allotted to each student for textbooks. So I'm curious, because there's so few people that have this programming and journalism skills, the skills together to do these types of projects, where do you find the funding? Is it advertising? Do you think it's more like a
So
civic?
the model that we're looking at for War Streets is that the research, there will eventually be a front-facing journalism, just like what you see at City Paper and Post-Gazette. We're going to do news stories and
Not
reports.
just like that.
Well, not just like, yes, a little different. But the data sets that we're going to be putting up will be behind a subscription. So you'll be able to subscribe and do some pretty deep research. So we're going to make it so it's easy to do some visualizations across certain databases to look for sort of the question that you might want to look at. For example, if you're a neighborhood group and you're going to go testify in front of city council on a particular topic, and maybe you want to do some research about who's already donated to the candidate or what their interests are. And there will be other data sets put in on top of this. We're just starting with it. But you'll be able to go in and kind of do that kind of research based on your own criteria, and then see data visualizations back that will help you understand it, not just get another spreadsheet back as well. But you'll also be able to download, to a certain extent, and we're still kind of talking through this, once we've cleaned the data set, you'll probably be able to download at least the raw campaign finance data. ProPublica has been putting that, cleaning the government data, putting it on the site, and then allowing you to do it in one big download if you want. So we're kind of talking through that too.
So, I mean, really the biggest idea, though, is to have a lot of interesting information in context.
Yeah.
I think that's really like the value add when we talk about the situation. Like, anyone can do what we're doing, but there's a lot of effort that goes into it, and there's a lot that we're sort of adding to it as we go along.
Well, thank you guys.